Okay, I'll hand it over to Judith.
Good morning. Our next presentation is on lessons learned, landowner, landmines, and unwanted guests. We have two presenters. The first one is Erin McKay, who's a senior natural resource specialist with Chelan County. Erin McKay has been with Chelan County Natural Resource Department for 5 years, prior to which she worked as a climbing ranger in the North Cascades National Park for 10 years. She has a BS in Natural Resource Management from Oregon State University and enjoys all the diverse facets of her current job in natural resources, especially the ones where she gets to be outside. Adam Pleeger is Field Supervisor for the Chelan County Noxious Weed Board. Adam graduated with a master's degree in fisheries science from Oregon State University. Prior to settling in Leavenworth, he worked at Olympic National Park for 7 years, doing coastal and mountain lake research and monitoring. Adam worked locally in environmental consulting for a few years before establishing his current career as field supervisor for the Chelan County Noxious Weed Board in 2019. Adam loves exploring the local mountains and waters with his wife Erin and daughter Camus, and is passionate about preserving Washington's native plant communities. I'm looking forward to your presentation, so go ahead when you're ready, Erin.
All right, thank you so much, Judith. So we all know that not every project goes perfectly or according to plan, and that's okay, and there's lessons to be learned from those projects. So I'm going to talk about a couple of recent projects where we've encountered some pitfalls and issues, and just go through what I've learned from those in hopes of helping you prevent that similar things from happening in your projects. The first topic I'm going to talk about dovetails a little bit with Mike's presentation on some of the landowner considerations that you want to think about going into a project. This is a story of two landowners on Icicle who did not get along very well. And you can see in this aerial photo the project area where we were developing a riparian restoration and bioengineered bank stabilization project on a nearly 800-foot linear stretch of riverfront on Icicle. And then kind of at the very upstream end, you can see another little greener portion with no riparian buffer as well, and that would be the neighboring landowner. This is an overview of the project area taken from the Chelan County Assessor site. The proposed riparian buffer area is shaded in magenta there. It covers 2 parcels, but those parcels are both owned by the same landowner, and we had worked extensively with this landowner to develop this project and some other restoration projects on his property too, and he's one of those pretty particular landowners, so it took a lot of coordination and design effort to come up with a design that he was supportive of. And we were looking at doing some bank grading, establishment of bioengineered bank tow protection structures with riparian plantings interspersed, and a robust buffer up the bank and up onto the upland there. So we finally got to a good place with the design, and during that time we started working with the upstream landowner as well in that narrow parcel with the red arrow pointing to it. We wanted to give that landowner a heads up of what we were thinking about, and then also find out if there was any interest from that landowner in extending the project onto his property, because he had similar issues of erosion and lack of riparian buffer on his property. So while we were talking with him, he made it clear to us that he actually owned a section of property extending out from his place downstream out in front of the proposed project area in magenta there. So that was a little confusing to us, because this, the assessor site shows just a straight property boundary to the river. When I did a little bit more digging and found a survey attached to the deed for this property owner, and you can see his parcel does apparently do a dog leg and extend out into the middle of Icicle Creek, out along the ordinary high water mark in front of our original proposed project area. So that in itself is a little odd, but we weren't going to do a project without having support from this landowner who has this legal description of property. And then suddenly this landowner decided that he wasn't actually comfortable with the project as we had proposed, because it became apparent that these two landowners were in a pretty long-standing dispute about property access, and in fact weren't even speaking to each other and hadn't been for over a decade. So I suddenly became this mediator between these two landowners to try to figure out how to make this project work and what the issue really was, why this landowner was uncomfortable with the project. And it appeared that the main reason was that he was afraid he was going to somehow lose his access to what he considered his property from the ordinary high water mark down, and we just couldn't move past that concern of that landowner, and the two landowners wouldn't work together to come to any sort of agreement or establish a documented agreement for access, since they weren't speaking to each other. So it put us in a position of, well, it's either we take it to the next step of doing some legal investigation and documentation for access with two landowners that won't work together, and that just wasn't something that we had the ability, the time, the funding, the desire to really do, and we weren't going to force a project and in an area where a landowner wasn't comfortable with it. So luckily we did have another project, a very similar project in the same reach that we've been developing in tandem with this one, and we were able to just shift focus and the remaining funding for design over to the other project, where we did have one willing landowner that we were working with. So it wasn't a total loss, but it was a pretty big eye-opener about how landowner tensions and disputes can really get in the way of a successful project. We're still working with these two landowners to see if there's a path forward, and potentially considering doing an altered version of the project that wouldn't impact that area around ordinary high water. But really, the best project would be a project that spans the whole denuded area of riverfront there. So we're still working through that. But the lessons that we learned from this experience: engage neighbors early on when you're planning a project. There can be unforeseen impacts on adjacent property owners, such as, what's your access route? Are you going to have machinery and dump trucks passing back and forth in somebody's backyard, and is that going to be really disruptive? The neighbors really do need to know about that and be able to provide their input before you get out there with your machines. And that goes also along with, what are the downstream impacts going to be? What are the view shed impacts going to be on neighbors? These things should all be considered, and it is really important to engage those neighbors. Know what your mediation limits are. We went pretty far with this one in mediation, but then when it turned to the court, to having to involve some legal entities, that's where we kind of had to draw the line and say, this really isn't our job. This is something that you guys need to figure out on your own, and hopefully we can get something done. Have your DNR aquatic lands story, your ownership story straight. So many landowners think that they own to the middle of the river and may have surveys and deeds that say that, but at the same time, the DNR aquatic lands program asserts ownership of up to the ordinary high water. So it's kind of a sticky wicket for us on some projects, and it's something that you need to have your approach already figured out when you're talking to landowners about these things. Our approach is typically to not argue with the landowner and tell them they don't own to the middle of the river, but rather just to say that we we need to conform to the DNR aquatic lands process, approval process for any project. Confirm your property lines with the landowners. Sometimes the assessor site has errors, and I've encountered this multiple times in different projects. So it's good to just talk with your landowners and get their story early on. And then finally, this is kind of just summarizing it all, just beware of landowner property disputes and access disputes, because these can really rear their heads in a project as you get closer and closer to implementation. So understanding what those are early on is very important. All right, moving on to the next lesson learned, and this is our unwanted guest section, and it has to do with invasive species and riparian planting. And I know it's something that we've all encountered, something that we know we should all be thinking of, but maybe we don't always put as much thought or planning into it as we should. And my guest, my helper here is an expert in the subject and also happens to be my husband, so kind of roped him into this, but he's going to help provide some more detailed information on how we can incorporate invasive species planning into our restoration project. So we'll look at how can you recognize the potential for invasive species encroachment on your projects. How can you incorporate invasive species management into your planting plan, your budget, and your maintenance schedule? So I'll talk about a couple of common species and potential treatment plans for those species. And then I'm going to talk about a quick case study that we've experienced recently that has led me to want to share this with you and make sure that everybody is thinking about this topic. So I'm going to hand it over to Adam.
All right. Thanks, Erin. So let's start with a plan. And I'm going to first pitch this idea that all restoration projects should really have an integrated weed management plan, big or small. And here's just a basic template of what one of these plans could look like. I'm going to kind of go through some of these points and why it's important and how it can benefit your restoration goals through time. So first is gathering your site information, and such as things like soil type. Is it coarse, sandy soils or clay soils? That can have a big impact on what native and invasive species are there and what native species are going to be able to adapt well to the new project. Irrigation, we see sites that have restoration done on them that have irrigation be really successful when they're competing against nuisance or invasive species. So if you can irrigate native species that you planted, you seem to have really good effects on that. So can you get irrigation onto your site? Your level of disturbance. So how big is this project going to be? Is it going to be a wheelbarrow and shovel size project? And is that going to mean that you could potentially do invasive species and weeding on your own? Or is this a large scale project that's going to use dump trucks and excavators and bulldozers where you're going to have a lot of soil disturbance, and that whenever there's large amounts of soil disturbance in the noxious weed world, we consider that as a red flag. And so a little bit higher attention is going to be paid to having a lot of soil disturbed where invasives could be established and take over. What do you already have there in terms of native plants? That's going to be really informative in terms of, can you use herbicides potentially to treat noxious weeds? Do you have animal corridors to your project site? Or is there livestock nearby? And that has an impact on also herbicide use and best methods to eradicate invasive weeds. And again, proximity to water is very important, particularly if you're going to use herbicides. There's restrictions with nearness to water. So a large-scale site information gathering is really important, as well as, of course, what do you have on the site? What weeds do you potentially have? And this is where noxious weed departments can really come and help out. There's a noxious weed department in every county in Washington State, except for Douglas. That's kind of a different story, but we're here to help. And so if you have questions of what weeds and what plant species are out there, You can send us photos. You can ask us to join site visits. So that's a resource, or you can learn the weed species on your own, of course. How large of an infestation are we talking about? Is it something one person can handle, or are you going to need contractors to work on it? What methods were the weeds originally introduced by? Was it from old road grade or railroad grade that the knapweed was brought in, or is it an animal corridor that potentially could be continuously bringing in invasive weed seeds? And knowing what you have is also a good point in time to start ranking the weeds that you have. So not all weeds are the same. There's 3 state-level noxious weeds, A, B, and C. All A-class weeds need to be eradicated. Class B and some C-class weeds need to be controlled, and that generally means flowering heads of the plants need to be removed. But then there's also lots of other and highly invasive plants and nuisance weeds that could hinder your restoration project. So kind of being able to rank the risk of what weeds you have. And then it's really, I think this is an important fact, is trying to get these management goals in terms of weed management that are compatible with your overall restoration goals. Lots of times, projects take a lot of time to get going, but once they're on the ground, it's pulling out the culvert, putting in the bridge, putting in some native plants, and calling it success. Well, that was like one growing season, whereas in the noxious weed world, we really look at a little bit longer windows. And so trying to be able to build time into your project to be able to go back to your sites and seeing if weeds have established and giving yourself ability to be adaptive to manage weeds that have established. Long-term goals is always, I think, to create a new habitat or restored habitat that's going to be able to shade out noxious weeds and be resilient against noxious weeds. So it's really, we're looking at that short-term goal of 1 to 3 years to establish new plants. Okay, so regarding weed priorities, also not only just knowing what ranking of weeds you have, but also preventing potential invaders coming into your pristine site, highly important, and we're going to talk a little bit about prevention techniques here in a second. And then also, are you going to need to be eradicating these Class A weeds, or is that the management goal is to eradicate? Or is it going to be to manage to suppress and manage the stands of weeds that are already there and suppress plants until you can establish native plants? So it's kind of having like a realistic goal of what you have and how you're going to manage them. And of course, this gets getting back into monitoring and evaluating your efficacy, is giving yourself time in your project to really see if your weed population is declining or if it's growing, and how you can, adjust your management skill practices to solve the weeds that you have. Okay, so you've got an integrated weed management plan, and out of that plan, you potentially have found some red flags, some plants that you're going to want to manage. And so this is where kind of like an integrated pest management plan comes into. And these are the 5 cornerstones of how we eradicate and control noxious weeds. So we're just going to go through these and see how you can integrate these potentially into future restoration projects. So first is prevention, and this really kind of comes down to, I think about this every time I'm out in the field, and I feel like everyone has their own responsibility to manage reducing the spread of invasive weeds. And that's really just simply taking the extra few minutes to clean your shoelaces and your cuffs, especially if you've already been tromping around in areas that you have invasive weeds in. Washing your tires and vehicles between project sites. And another one I think that's a good one that you can do is you can write into your contracts to require your contractors to wash the machinery before entering your project site. This is just so often we've had bulldozers come into a pristine area with mud and weed seeds on their tracks and establish new noxious weed populations in what was previously pristine areas. So those are things that you can do to prevent weeds from coming to your sites. What happens if you have some weeds? You can use mechanical and physical techniques such as hand pulling, tilling, and mowing. Tillage is always a risky one because that's establishing more exposed soil. But if you're going to be intensively planting and irrigating, tillage might be an option. Mechanical and physical options are really good at controlling noxious weeds, but not necessarily good at eradicating noxious weeds. So it's more of a control method, not an eradication method. Biological is, a lot of people think of it as a golden bullet, but unfortunately it's really limited to certain plant species. So if you have a large scale place with lots of diffuse knapweed or Dalmatian toadflax, there are actually biological pests that you could release that could get results, and the results are stunning. But it's really selective to certain plant species, and it's a long-term commitment. You got to let them bugs build up their population and kind of do their job. And it's also, you have to realize you're going to be living with some levels of weeds in these areas. It's not going to be completely eradicated. When we get to a lot of bad noxious weeds that are really difficult to remove, it comes down to chemical control is the best bet, and because we see effectiveness. But whenever you're using chemicals, I think it's really important to know what you're using, read the label, have a licensed applicator to apply your herbicide, know that there's different types of herbicides that are out there. There's selective herbicides that can hit just broadleaves, or there's non-selective herbicides that will kill everything, and some of them have residual in the soil. And some of that residual can have collateral damage. So just knowing what you're using is really important if you're going to put some herbicide down. And then cultural. I think cultural techniques is what we often in restoration projects kind of lean on in terms to control noxious weeds, and that's introduce competition through native plantings, potentially irrigate, maybe fertilize, add mulch. But I often see in project sites that just one of these methodologies, such as cultural control, isn't necessarily enough to walk away and suppress noxious weeds. Often you're going to try to use a couple of these techniques in collaboration to take down the problems that you have in terms of noxious weeds. So let's jump into a couple just good case examples of noxious weeds and how to control them. Diffuse knapweed. Super common throughout here on the eastern Washington area. A biannual, sometimes a triannual. Year one, it'll put out a rosette, like the photo on the left there. That's when it's most susceptible to control. If it's a small scale project, you could shovel out and pull all the rosettes in your site. And if you can come back a second year and do that, you're actually going to see really good control of your diffuse knapweed. Also, when it's in the rosette stage is when it's really susceptible to an herbicide application. So if you can go out through there with a 2,4-D or a broadleaf specific herbicide, you could spray the spot spray diffuse knapweed, and picture in the center, that knapweed would be killed and all your grasses, your desirable grasses would be growing. So that's two good methods there. Now, if your site looks like the picture on the right, where you have a giant field of diffuse knapweed, mowing that is going to be pretty difficult, and that's only going to be short-term control. You don't want to spray necessarily acres of herbicide because that would require lots of manual labor, and then you'd have to replant. So this is one of these circumstances where biological control would be a reasonable approach because it's such a large-scale landscape infestation. So there's diffuse knapweed and some ideas on how to manage diffuse knapweed. How about a different plant? So Canada thistle, really common in moist restoration areas and sites around fence rows, but a total different life cycle. So you can't just approach all noxious weeds the same. So if you try to hand pull or dig Canada thistle, you're not going to kill it at all. If anything, you're going to probably spread it by its rhizomes. So it's a perennial. It spreads mostly through rhizomes deep down in the soil. And so mowing can be a good way to suppress the flowering, but it's going to come back right back the next year. So this is one of these circumstances where the best option we found is an herbicide application of like a milestone type product where it'll be systemic. So you spray it in the later fall where the plant has taken its nutrients down into the roots, and the herbicide goes with it and kills the roots of the plant. So maybe like a small follow-up the next year, and you're going to see really dramatic control of a plant like this. So not all weeds are the same, but having a plan on to manage them and having that plan set up ahead of schedule is really going to benefit your project's outcomes. So I think I'm going to pass it back to Erin to have her go through a case example of one of her projects.
Perfect, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a project that was installed in 2018 on Nason Creek. This is an aerial of part of the project. It involved a channel relocation and oxbow connection, so there was actually excavation of a channel occurring. So there's a lot of heavy equipment on site, a lot of disturbance. We did have monitoring written into our project budget, so we monitored for a couple years following installation, and the project monitoring revealed that there was pretty intense competition. After a couple years, there was pretty intense competition from invasive species at the site. We hadn't written in action, adaptive management actions for invasive species. So when this was revealed, luckily we were able to, we had some funding that shook loose from a different task that came in under budget, and we were able to reallocate a little bit and come in and do some adaptive management here. But that was fortunate. So this was just a really good reminder to us that we needed to have more adaptive management included in our actual project plan and budget. There's a before, well, immediately post-project photo in 2018, and then a 2020 post-project photo where you can see that there has been a lot of encroachment. The main species were oxeye daisy and diffuse knapweed. There was a little bit of tansy too. We were able to contract with a Woodland, I think, resources. There are multiple contractors out there who can do this type of work, but we hired a contractor to backpack spray for diffuse knapweed and oxeye daisy. In the fall of 2020, we also were able to install additional native plants to repopulate the area from the ones that there was mortality, and then adding mulch to the site as well. We also plan to contract again for additional spraying for 2021, potentially twice. As Autumn was saying, it helps to hit these species at different life stages, so you can get the rosettes, the first year rosettes, and then later on you can hit the flowering plants and hopefully disrupt the seed source and help the problem. So we're using both biological and cultural approach to the site to help those native species get a foothold and be able to, we're not going to be able to get rid of every weed on site, but we will, the idea is to control it enough to let the native species grow large enough to outcompete. So our lessons learned for invasive species and those unwanted guests that often move into your site, the invasive species management really does need to be a part of your riparian planting plan and your overall project plan. And I know there's a box for it in ecology's riparian planting plan, but it needs to be more than just a few words and an intent. There really should be a follow-up plan included in your project budget and schedule. The plan should potentially include a pre-treatment if you are coming into an area that already has a lot of weeds, and then at least 1 year, ideally 2 or more years of treatment following the year of plant installation. And again, especially for those sites where there's either a lot of disturbance happening or where there's already invasive species present, and it's very likely going to be an issue in the future. Mulch is great, but often it's not quite enough, and sometimes you might be bringing in invasive species with your mulch, so you need to be careful about what kind of mulch you're using. Hiring contractors to help you with this can be pretty cheap. I don't think it was more than up to $4,000 or $5,000 to have the backpack spraying done, but it does require staff time to coordinate that work and a commitment to follow up, for those extra couple of years afterwards. So just think about writing an extra year of management into your grants for weed management, or if you have a different grant that you're working on into the future, think about adding some adaptive management for other sites into that. And then working with project partners can be really helpful in this. Who's the landowner that you're working with? Does that landowner have a weed management program on their own? Is this on WSDOT right away? WSDOT does have an invasive species department, and we've worked with them to help pre-treat some areas that we're installing plants in. Is it Forest Service land? If you're doing NEPA, you'll have to consult with the district botanist anyway, but even if you're not, they can be really helpful with a weed management plan and just advising on how to have a low impact project with lower likelihood of invasive species encroachment. The county noxious weed boards can help advise, as Adam was saying. They're happy to help you work on your weed management plan, and are very happy to hear that we're considering this within our restoration projects. The state noxious weed site is super helpful. The website is here, but you can also just Google Washington State noxious weeds, and that can help with identification, with treatment plans, just overall information that you can use to incorporate into your project. So that's about it. That's all we wanted to say. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Erin and Adam. I don't see any questions yet.
There's one in the chat box. On your first case study, should the county's critical area ordinance and or a shoreline master program support convincing landowners to retain, restore the riparian buffer? Or could the county's critical area ordinance?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a delicate question. It certainly should, but ultimately you can't force the hand of a landowner to do something. And in this case, the landowner did say that they were interested in supportive of restoration, but their overall concern of losing access trumps that, and they just didn't want to open a can of worms, really. So I think it's a good tool to help make your case, but a lot of landowners just aren't going to be comfortable. I mean, we run into it with the 75-foot required buffer too, which totally makes sense and is really what it takes to restore a buffer, but a lot of landowners just aren't going to be willing to what they consider give that up,
There's a question in the Q&A. Do you have recommendations for ensuring materials imported to the site, such as mulch, fill, woody material, are free of weeds?
I know that you can buy certified weed-free straw mulch. As far as mulch that you're sourcing from, I mean, a lot of times mulch is an in-kind donation from landowners that may have material on site already, or from a different project. So that kind of stuff isn't going to have documentation with it. And I think just calling out to look at your site, to look at the site where the mulch is coming from first. If you see like weeds growing on the mulch pile or around the mulch pile, it's very likely that you're going to import some of those seeds with your source. So I think just being picky about your source is a smart move, and even if it means you have to purchase mulch from somewhere versus get it for free, it's still going to be worth it to avoid, you know, creating a potential noxious weed issue.
Another question, we'll have this be our last question and then go to the next presentation. Do you have any experience with or see any applicability for using goats in weed control?
I'm going to say it depends, and I think Adam has something to say too.
Yeah, that was something recently done by here in Chelan County by, I think it was headed up by the fire department, and it was originally to use goats to suppress understory shrubs for, you know, a steep bank. In general, what we've seen is goats are pretty good at, you know, making lots of little disturbance on the soil, and I mean they're basically moving lawnmowers, and so they're gonna potentially open up some soil disturbance through their footprints, and they're going to mow the plants down for that year. But not necessarily a long-term solution. And again, goats are just as picky as other animals, so if it's a weed that isn't desirable for them, they're going to avoid it unless they have no other options. So in general, we kind of edge away from that as a great management plan. It sounds pretty good, but the results, you know, are starting to come in, and they're mixed at best. If that helps.
Great, thank you. Adrian, I gave you the presenter ball, so you should